Hello again, everyone. Within this lecture, we are going to be continuing the discussion that we were having on punishment. In this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about negative punishment. This topic corresponds with TCO item G19 from the Behavior Change Procedures section, which we covered in the previous lecture. We'll just be expanding on by discussing negative punishment. So let's get started with this lecture by talking about the definition for negative punishment. And this is a definition that you should have been exposed to already multiple times in this course and in the previous ABA course that you took. But we're going to review it anyways just to make sure that you understand all of the different components that go along with negative punishment. So negative punishment is a procedure in which a response is followed immediately by the removal of a stimulus, which decreases the future probability of that particular behavior. Okay, so if we have our ABC contingency, right? Our antecedent behavior. Sorry, it always takes me so long to write on here. We have our antecedent behavior and our consequence. Let's say a particular behavior occurs. The stimulus that follows is going to be a stimulus that's being removed. The stimulus that's being removed is typically a desirable stimulus, and this is important to keep in mind. It's typically a stimulus that the person wants to have access to. And so because you're removing a stimulus that the person wants to have access to, we see a decrease in that behavior that resulted in the loss of that desirable stimulus. Okay, I'll give you guys a personal example. I have, for FIU, we use our Outlook emails. And when I began using my Outlook emails, I used to get meeting invitations like to my email. So let's say my boss used to send me a Zoom link. And whenever she would send me a Zoom link, if I accepted the meeting, there was like an option to click accept, like that I would be joining the meeting. So if I accepted the meeting, the email would completely disappear. It was very odd, but it would completely go away from my inbox, and then I had no idea how I could find the meeting link in the future when I was trying to join the meeting. So what I did was, in the future, whenever I would get an invitation in my email, I would see that button, the accept button, and instead what I would do is I would reply and I would say, great, I'll see you then, or looking forward to our meeting, but I would never touch the accept button anymore, because in the past, when I would touch the accept button, the entire email would go away, and that was not something that I wanted to experience. So in this particular case, that's an example of negative punishment for me. This antecedent behavior consequence relationship, or this contingency, made it so that my behavior went down in the future. The behavior of clicking the accept button went down. So it was punished, and it was punished by the removal of that email with the link to the meeting that I needed to attend. Okay, so this is an example of negative punishment that just occurs naturally in our day-to-day lives. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, if you watched the lecture on chapter 14 on positive punishment, then you heard me talk about how punishment is not this negative, should not be viewed in this negative light, right? Punishment is something that occurs naturally in everybody's day-to-day life, and it has survival value in a lot of cases. There are some times where it's used for disciplining, and those are the different procedures that we'll be talking about today. But there are also times when, like the example that I just gave you guys, you're going to come into contact naturally with these punishing contingencies, and it's going to help you improve certain skills in your life, or just it'll help you with your survival, whatever the case may be. So punishment should again not be associated with this negative connotation in most cases. Of course, in the case of misuse of punishment, misapplication of punishment, then sure, I understand it being viewed negatively, especially since punishment can be associated with emotional reactions and things of that sort. Those are all things that need to be accounted for, and you need to try to mitigate. But what I'm trying to the point I'm trying to get across here is that punishment is not this negative thing. okay? Not within behavior analysis. It doesn't need to be viewed that way. There are many behaviors that we engage in our day-to-day lives that are contacting certain consequences, which is having a punishing effect on our behavior. There are going to be two different negative punishment procedures that we will be discussing in this lecture today. Those are timeout procedures and response cost procedures. Timeout is a term that you are likely to have already been exposed to at some point in your life, but the actual name for the procedure within behavior analysis is called timeout from positive reinforcement, and it's best, honestly, that you remember the entire term this way. It's okay if in your practice you just refer to it as timeout, but if you remember the entire term as timeout from positive reinforcement, then you will always remember how you implement the procedure, because basically you are removing the person, contingent on problem behavior, you are removing access to positive reinforcers for a very specific amount of time, or contingent on problem behavior, you are going to withdraw the opportunity to earn positive reinforcers. That's why if you remember the term timeout from positive reinforcement, you'll be able to remember the procedure pretty easily. Because it's either you're removing access to reinforcers, or you're not allowing the person to gain access to reinforcers, contingent on problem behavior in both instances. Okay, and there are certain things that you want to keep in mind when you are implementing a positive punishment procedure such as timeout. It's very important that the person is able to discriminate, right? In order for the procedure to be effective, the person needs to discriminate between the quote-unquote time-in environment and the timeout environment. And usually we want the time-in environment to be a reinforcing environment and an environment that the person has some sort of desire to participate in. If the person does not have a desire to participate in the time-in environment, then the timeout is not likely to be effective, because there is no timeout from positive reinforcement if the time-in environment doesn't have access to reinforcers. So then you really wouldn't be implementing a timeout procedure. And it's possible you might actually be reinforcing the person's behavior instead. Okay, so we want to make sure that the person is able to discriminate between the time out and the time in environment, and you have to set up the conditions for it to be a discriminable condition, basically. Okay, then you want the loss of reinforcement or the loss of access to reinforcement to be immediate. So following the occurrence of whatever problem behavior. Following the occurrence of that problem behavior, the loss of reinforcement or the loss of the opportunity to earn reinforcement needs to occur immediately. This is the same for any other punishment procedure or any other reinforcement procedure that you are going to implement. You need to consider the temporal relation within which you are presenting that reinforcer in relation to that behavior. So the behavior occurs, you immediately want to present the punisher, or in this case, we're removing the access to positive reinforcement. And then these things, and if you implement the timeout procedure effectively, then you should see a decrease in the future frequency of the problem behavior. If you don't see a reduction in the future frequency of problem behavior, then it's not likely that your timeout procedure is functioning as a punishment procedure. And so then you need to evaluate whether you were implemented the procedure correctly, or maybe it's just not an effective procedure for that individual. Or for that behavior, I'm sorry, I should not have said for that individual. For that particular behavior, it might not be an effective procedure, or it might not be the best procedure to implement in the environment that you're trying to implement it, given whatever constraints you might have in that environment, so on and so forth. There are two different types of timeout procedures that we're going to be discussing. We have non-exclusionary timeout, and then we have exclusionary timeout. In your textbook, they actually refer to these procedures as non-exclusion timeout or exclusion timeout. Whichever way you refer to them is fine. People in the field will understand you. And I think in different textbooks, they refer to these different procedures in different ways. Okay. Non-exclusion timeout, we're going to discuss the distinction between these two, but just in a general sense, non-exclusion timeout is when you try to keep the person in the environment and you simply withhold reinforcers from them. And then exclusionary timeout is when you completely remove the person from the time and environment for a few minutes. And out of these two procedures, the least restrictive procedure is the non-exclusionary timeout procedure. Therefore, we as practitioners in the field of applied behavior analysis are ethically bound to use the least restrictive alternative of procedures. And so that means that we should be using the non-exclusionary timeout as much as we reasonably can, right? So that should be your first choice over exclusionary timeout. Of course, there are going to be some environmental constraints that won't allow for non-exclusionary timeouts to be effective, right? If you cannot control for the reinforcers in that time and environment, then it might not be possible for you to do non-exclusionary timeout, and you might have to do exclusionary timeout. But as wherever possible, we should be pushing for the use of non-exclusionary timeout over the use of exclusionary timeout, because it is the least restrictive alternative if you're reasonably able to accommodate that intervention. Okay. And then the timeout procedure should be implemented for between 2 to 5 minutes each time that it's implemented. And you would have specific guidelines for your practitioners on how long you want them to implement it. But the general guidelines are that the timeout sessions should be between 2 to 5 minutes. Okay. If you've ever experienced timeout yourselves, or you've implemented timeout yourselves, or seen other people implement timeout, then it's possible that you haven't seen timeout be implemented in the correct way, or following the evidence-based practices for timeout that have been found through behavior analytic research, okay? Most people, when they implement timeout, they implement it for much longer, and it's implemented in a different way. Maybe the reinforcers are not being withheld properly. They're not making sure that there's a reduction in the future frequency of the behavior, so on and so forth. So we're going to go on to discuss, how we can make sure that we are appropriately implementing these different types of timeout procedures. This is a figure from your textbook. It is figure 15.2, and it includes a breakdown of the different types of punishment procedures. So if you look at the top, we have up here the timeout from positive reinforcement. The different timeout procedures is what I meant to say. We have timeout from positive reinforcement, which can then be broken down into non-exclusionary timeout or exclusionary timeout, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And then within the non-exclusionary timeout, we have 4 different types of procedures that can be implemented. So we have planned ignoring, terminating specific reinforcer contact, we have contingent observation, and then we have a partition or a spaced timeout, a select spaced timeout. Okay, and then with an exclusionary timeout, we can either remove the person from the time and environment, or we can remove the time and setting from the person. So we're going to be discussing each of these, and I'll show you guys what each of these looks like. So we'll begin with non-exclusionary timeout, and again, we're going to cover all of the different procedures that I just mentioned in the previous slide. Okay, so non-exclusionary timeout is when, contingent on the occurrence of the target behavior, the participant is able to remain in the time and environment, but there's certain things about the environment that are going to be changed. Okay, so they're going to lose the opportunity to earn reinforcers, or a specific, these are the different options basically. So they'll lose the opportunity to earn a reinforcer, or a specific reinforcer will be terminated. So if they were already interacting with a particular reinforcer, that'll be removed. Or they might be moved around in the environment in some way so that they're not able to continue receiving reinforcement from whatever activity was going on in the environment. So this is a repositioning which is going to occur so that observations of ongoing activities continue, so they'll still be able to observe what's going on in the environment, but they won't get access to reinforcement from that. And then finally, the other option is that the individual is removed to a different space within that setting, but maybe their visibility is limited, and again, they're not going to be able to access reinforcement during that time. I have a visual here of a type of timeout example, and it's a non-exclusionary timeout procedure. This is a timeout procedure that uses a ribbon around a person's wrist. So basically, when they are wearing the ribbon, reinforcement can be provided, and when they are not wearing the ribbon, reinforcement cannot be provided, meaning that they are in a timeout. This is again provided contingent on problem behavior. their wristband is taken away, meaning that they're not allowed to receive any reinforcement for a few minutes. Again, between 2 to 5 minutes is the appropriate amount of time for a timeout procedure. So the first procedure we're going to be discussing is planned ignoring. Planned ignoring is a type of non-exclusionary timeout in which the person is already in an environment that is reinforcing. Again, in all of the timeout procedures, this is something that needs to be satisfied. They're already in an environment that is reinforcing, but they start to engage in a problem behavior. And when they engage in that problem behavior, what the therapist does, or what the researcher does, is they withhold, or they remove, they don't withhold, they remove attention or physical contact or verbal interactions, whatever form of attention was being provided, they remove that attention contingent on the problem behavior. And then basically when they stop engaging in the problem behavior, then you engage with them again. So this looks like systematically looking away from the individual. You're going to remain quiet, or you might refrain from any interaction for that specific amount of time, usually the time that they're engaging in the specific problem behavior. Typically, I like to, if you had to implement this intervention, you want to implement it with by teaching also an appropriate behavior that they can engage in, that they can get access to reinforcement for. So that when they're not engaging in that behavior, they have an alternative appropriate behavior that they are getting reinforcement for. Okay, so you can pair this along with that. I included a short video here of people at a clinic that are demonstrating the use of planned ignoring along with a positive reinforcement procedure. I apologize for the sounds of my son screaming in the background. So, one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about is the ethics of implementing something such as planned ignoring. If this is an intervention that we are discussing, it's because it's an evidence-based practice. There has been a lot of research conducted on this intervention that shows it's an effective intervention. However, there is not a lot of research that has been conducted on the long-term effects of this intervention. But there's anecdotal evidence, I guess, from people who have experienced ABA themselves, and they have experienced this intervention, planned ignoring, and they feel that they have reported that the intervention and ABA in general was abusive or traumatic to them. Okay. I cannot speak to the quality of the behavior services that they received, but I do think that it's good practice anyways to always keep ethics in mind when you're implementing whatever intervention you're implementing, or when you're selecting an intervention for a particular behavior. I personally don't like to be ignored. There have been instances when I have had to implement an intervention such as planned ignoring. And when I do implement an intervention such as planned ignoring, I make sure that I am still seeing the client as a human, that I'm ignoring the particular behavior, but ignoring the particular behavior does not mean that I'm going to ignore the client altogether. And so that's just, something that I want you guys to keep in mind when you're implementing this intervention. There's a lot of research that I think still needs to be done in these areas as far as the looking at the long-term effects of interventions such as these. Planned ignoring is not something that's exclusive to behavior analysis. This is something that people implement generally, whether they know about behavior analysis or not. But it is an intervention that we teach in behavior analysis. And so I think that if we teach this intervention and we teach practitioners to use this intervention, then we also need to teach practitioners to think about how this intervention could potentially be affecting our clients. Think about the social validity of the intervention that you're going to use. And how it's affecting your client. If you see your client's not having a big emotional reaction to it, then I think you can possibly continue the use of it. But if you're having to use maybe planned ignoring for a long time and you're seeing very big emotional reactions in response to the treatment, then you could possibly look at maybe exploring other options, or you could look at looking at using an intervention maybe that's less restrictive for the individual. Just food for thought as far as planned ignoring goes, and really just any of the interventions that we talk about You always want to consider how it's affecting your client. These things are not one size fits all. What you read in your textbook should not be implemented in a black and white manner. You could be pairing these interventions along with other interventions, like for example in the video that I shared with you guys on this slide. Right, please click on the link and go to the video. Unfortunately, I don't know why, but when I play videos for you guys in my recordings, when you guys try to play it back, the video doesn't show up, and so I figured providing the link is probably a little bit more. It's going to be more effective rather than you guys watching 3 minutes of a blank screen. So please watch that video, because in that video they do show the combination of planned ignoring with positive reinforcement for an alternative behavior. So they're using, they have taught another skill that will allow that individual to access reinforcement. So let's move on to discussing the other type of non-exclusionary timeout, which is where you terminate a specific reinforcer contingent on the problem behavior occurring. This is a really simple form of timeout. It's just you engage in the problem behavior, and whatever positive reinforcement activity or item you had access to, that immediately ends for a specific amount of time contingent on the problem behavior. So an example of this terminating a specific reinforcer contingent on problem behavior, I can use my son for this example. So my son my son engages in all kinds of behaviors at the table. And one of the behaviors that he engages in is he grabs his fork and he smashes it onto, he's stabbing the table, and it ends up leaving a ton of little marks on our dining table. So if he's watching TV when he engages in this behavior, I'll pause the TV for a few seconds, and then I'll put it back on after a few seconds has passed. So this is an example of me terminating a specific reinforcer, the TV time, contingent on him engaging in the behavior of stabbing the table with his fork, which results in a bunch of little marks being left on our table. Okay, now let's discuss another non-exclusionary timeout procedure. This is called contingent observation. So contingent observation, again, the definition is basically in the name. It's contingent on the problem behavior. The individual is made to just observe the other people engaging in the reinforcing activities. So the person engages in problem behavior and they are asked to sit away, or they are moved from the area such that they're still able to observe the activities that the other individuals are engaging in, but they themselves cannot access those reinforcing activities, or they cannot participate in the activities that everyone else is participating in. So an example of this, I don't know if everyone maybe had the same experience, probably not, because everyone's from different generations, but when I was in school, I remember that the teacher used to have her desk, and next to her desk, she would always put a student's desk, and that student's desk that she had next to her desk was empty, and it was only filled after a student would engage in problem behavior. So contingent on a student engaging in problem behavior, she would have them go sit at that table next to her desk. This is an example of contingent observation because that individual is still placed in the room, so they're still able to see the activities that are going on. They're just not able to participate in the activities that are going on. So I've included a video for you guys where you can see a teacher very calmly telling students to go sit in a chair after they engage in a particular problem behavior. In the video, we don't see the problem behavior that the individuals engage in, but we can see how the teacher very calmly tells them to go sit in a chair. They go sit in a chair, and then the student sits there calmly observing the other children engage in the problem behavior. The other children engaging in appropriate behavior and engaging in the activities that the individual would ideally see as reinforcing activities. Because again, in order for this to function as a punishment, as punishment, their behavior has to go down, but also that means that the time in environment, or the environment in which they would normally be participating in, has to be an environment that's reinforcing for them, and that they would be interested in being a part of. I do also want to mention, because I've seen attempts at this type of non-exclusionary timeout being implemented in a classroom setting. So I've seen where teachers try to implement contingent observation, but it's not, they're not successful in their implementation. And one of the reasons that they're not successful is because the student still has access to their peers. Their peers might look at them, they might make jokes, or the student themselves or the client themselves might draw on the table. They might have access to reinforcers still. So this is only going to be effective, and this goes for all of the different timeout procedures. It's really only going to be effective if you can isolate the reinforcer so that the individual is not able to access reinforcement during their timeout period. They're not supposed to have access to fun activities during their timeout period. They're not supposed to be engaging with peers during that time, right? Because that on its own it could possibly be reinforcing. So I can vividly recall this one classroom that I was in, where the teacher had the student sit at the front of the class in like a separate desk that was at the front of the class. She separated him, and the student would turn around and make jokes with the other kids. So what was supposed to serve as a timeout for this kid was really not a timeout. He was still able to access reinforcers during that time, and so it didn't function to reduce his behavior at all. And yet the teacher continued to implement the intervention because in her head traditionally, a timeout procedure is you just separate the child from the other from the other children, and that on its own should function as punishment. But we should never just assume that a procedure is going to function as a punishment procedure or even as a reinforcement-based procedure, right? We should never assume. We need to always make sure that we are collecting data on the behavior and seeing how the behavior is changing in the future. Is the behavior increasing or is the behavior decreasing, right? And if it's going to function as a negative punishment procedure, then we should be seeing the behavior go down in frequency. If the behavior is not going down in frequency, then you are not implementing a timeout procedure successfully. Okay, so just keep those things in mind. Let's discuss now the last form of non-exclusionary timeout, which is the partition/select space timeout procedure. And this is a timeout procedure in which, contingent on problem behavior occurring, the implementer or the therapist, teacher, whoever it is, asks the individual to move to an area in the room that is divided by some sort of panel or some divider, which doesn't allow that person to be in full view of everybody that's present in that room. So this is good because it allows that individual to have some more privacy when they are experiencing the timeout procedure. But there are some disadvantages that go along with it as well. So the main advantage is really that it keeps, quote unquote, I would say this is quote unquote, it keeps the student within the time and setting. So they're still in the setting in which the problem behavior occurred, right? They're not being completely removed from that setting. But many people would argue that this is a form of exclusionary timeout because although you are keeping the person in the physical room, there is some division in that between the time in environment and the timeout environment, and you are in some way isolating that individual from the rest of the group. So some people will argue that this is a form of exclusionary timeout. Now, there are some additional disadvantages, which is that people might, or students, or other participants in the group might give some negative comments towards the person that's in the timeout at that given time, right? But I would argue that that's something that could occur also, even during contingent observation, in the example that I just gave you guys in the previous slide. You also have to be really cautious because since the individual is in a more isolated area of the room, they might be more prone to engage in other forms of problem behavior, or they might somehow access reinforcers during the time that they're in that particular timeout setting. So you just want to keep those things in mind and try to, as much as possible, keep the timeout environment from being reinforcing, because we want the time in environment to be where they access reinforcement. If the timeout environment is reinforcing on its own, then you're not going to get the effect of punishment that you wanted, and that behavior is not likely to go down. Okay, So now we are jumping into the second type of negative punishment procedure that we have. So I told you guys we have non-exclusionary timeout, which the 4 previous procedures that we discussed are the 4 types of non-exclusionary timeout procedures that we have within behavior analysis. Now we're going to discuss exclusionary timeout, or as your textbook calls it, exclusion timeout. And exclusionary timeout is when you physically remove the individual from that time and environment. Well, you don't have to physically take them out, right? You can just tell them, okay, go sit in the hallway, for example. But basically, the exclusionary timeout is when that person is no longer allowed to be in that time and environment. They are placed in a completely separate room. And then there's 2 ways to implement this intervention. We can either remove the participant from the room, so we can remove the participant from the time and environment, or we can, and this one sounds a little bit odd, but it's definitely something that is implemented in classroom settings, or some people do a variation of this at home. Basically, it's where the time and environment is removed from the participant. So if you're not able to remove the participant themselves, then okay, let's remove everything else. And we're no longer going to engage in this particular reinforcing activity here. Everyone's going to move and engage in this activity in a completely different area. So we're going to talk about when you would use each of these different procedures. So first we'll discuss the timeout procedure, the exclusionary timeout procedure, which involves removing the participant from the time in setting. Okay, and for this particular procedure, we usually have a timeout room in which the individual is placed in a confined setting where they can be safe, they can be secure, they're supervised, there's really not, there's no harm that they can cause to other people or to themselves. There's also in this particular area, it doesn't have to be a room specifically. It's really just an area where they can be, again, kept safe, where they are not allowed to be in the presence of other people. And in this particular space, you want them to not have access to positive reinforcers. Or any potential reinforcers. Again, you want the timeout environment to not be a reinforcing environment so that it functions as a timeout procedure, and so that the time and environment is reinforcing to be in, because we want the removal of the positive reinforcers to function as a punisher in order to reduce the behavior, whatever target behavior was occurring. We want that to be reduced in the future. So you want to very carefully and place the individual in the timeout room. You can ask them to be taken to the timeout, like ask them to go into the timeout room. In some cases, if the behavior is so severe, right? Like I've had a client that would throw chairs in a classroom setting, would throw water bottles, would launch his body across, would launch his body at other students. I don't know how to describe that behavior to you guys, but it was a very severe topography of problem behavior. And so this is, I think, the only client that I've ever had to implement an exclusionary timeout for. And it involved us in some instances having to physically remove him from the environment just because of how unsafe it was for him to be in the setting with so many people surrounding him and with so many objects surrounding him. Okay, so in this type of setting, you want to have as little furniture as possible, as few objects. Some of these rooms, if you're in a setting that does have like an actual timeout room, usually they're padded rooms with not much in it, if anything at all. Again, so I like this one that says that you want it to be located in close proximity to the time and setting. I remember when we were implementing this exclusionary timeout procedure with this client, it was at a school setting. And like I mentioned, it was very severe topographies of problem behavior that this client was engaging in, and they were very high rates too. And the school did not have an ideal timeout setting for us. And it was very, very, very difficult to implement this procedure properly in the way that it's intended to be implemented. And the school suggested we walk the child over to their office, which was, I want to say, maybe a 5-minute walk away from the classroom, in order for us to implement the timeout procedure over there. So can you imagine this child engaging in severe forms of problem behavior and us having to walk him 5 minutes away to get to the office. That wouldn't work. So you want the location of the timeout setting to be very close in proximity to the time and setting. Because if you are at a point where you're having to use an exclusionary timeout, which is a very highly restrictive procedure, if you're at the point where you have to implement something like this, then it's very likely that it's a severe form of behavior. And so being able to transport that individual safely to a setting that's far away is highly unlikely. This particular client that I'm mentioning to you guys, the setting that we had to implement this timeout procedure in was, or the school told us the only other setting would be in the hallway outside of that classroom, and that was not an ideal setting because this kid could just run away. There were peers that would pass by that would say hi to him. There was a park right outside of where his classroom was, and he could see other peers playing there and his previous teacher there, so it would have functioned as a proper timeout setting. So these are all things that you have to consider. Sometimes the environment that you're in is not going to be conducive to certain interventions being implemented, just because you don't have the proper support, or you don't have the proper how do I say this, the proper tools available to you. Something else that you want to keep in mind when you're implementing an exclusionary timeout procedure is that the room should never be locked. Then that you should always be monitoring the individual that's in that room, right? So if you placed your client in a timeout room, because again, this is a procedure that you should have, that your behavior analyst should have very clearly written out for you guys. If you're the behavior analyst, then you should be very clearly writing out the protocol and the procedures. You should have very clearly trained your therapist on how to implement it. Well, one of the things that you need to be doing is making sure that that individual is constantly monitored when they are in that room, that they are safe, that nothing, harmful is going to happen to them. Okay. I have seen things in school settings in particular that I guarantee I can confidently say were not part of a protocol and was just an RBT going rogue, right? They were doing something that was outside of their treatment plan just because of the way that I had seen it be implemented. So I was in a classroom setting one time and I saw a therapist put her client, this was a classroom setting that had a bathroom in the room. This therapist put her client in the bathroom and closed the door and shut the door. Imagine a bathroom, because he was engaging in problem behavior, a bathroom that has hard surfaces all over the place, a toilet, sink, who knows what else is in that room that could possibly cause, like that child could possibly get hurt by. And I don't know, that was not my client nor anybody that I worked with. It's just when you're in school settings, you see certain things sometimes and you are just like, you can tell that they're not implementing procedures that were written up by a behavior analyst. They're just doing whatever, they chose to implement in that particular moment. And that is such a dangerous thing that therapist did. Imagine if that child had gotten hurt in that room, not to mention that they're implementing an intervention ineffectively, that they're implementing it in a manner that could be harmful to that individual, that they are not following the treatment plan that was written by their behavior analyst, right? So whenever you are implementing exclusionary timeout, it's number one, because you have the individual engages in a severe form of problem behavior, and it was the first intervention possibly that you chose because it's so severe, and you had to keep everybody safe and you had to keep themselves safe, or because you've exhausted all forms of least restrictive interventions and you have now made it to this point where you have decided to use this restrictive intervention based off of months worth of data that have shown that these positive interventions have been ineffective. Okay, so if you're using exclusionary timeout, you should have a very precise protocol that was written out. You should have therapists and staff that have been trained on how to implement the procedure. You should have an appropriate setting to implement the procedure. There are a lot of safeguards that should be put in place in order to protect your clients and make sure that they are not harmed during this process. Now let's continue our discussion on some of the advantages and disadvantages of using the exclusionary timeout room. And I have talked about some of these a little bit already. So the only one I really want to come back to is the disadvantage, which is that using a timeout room might be negatively reinforcing for the person that's implementing the procedure. So if you recall in our previous presentation for chapter 14, I mentioned to you guys that implementing a punishment procedure can be negatively reinforcing for the person that's implementing the procedure, because the behavior, the aversive stimulus, which it would be your participant's behavior or your client's behavior, reduces by implementing the punishment procedure. And so for that reason, it can become negatively reinforcing. So we have to keep that in mind and, have parameters and safeguards in place in order to avoid the misuse and overuse of the timeout room. There should be a specific target behavior that's defined. You should have exit criteria for when you're no longer going to use the timeout room, how long they're supposed to be in that room, and so on and so forth. So we'll be talking about some of these, protocols, or how to set up your protocol to avoid some of these misuse or misapplications of the timeout room. The other form of exclusionary timeout, which I mentioned to you guys a few slides ago, is when you remove when you don't remove the participant from the room, but instead you remove everything else or everyone else from the setting. So in the example that I gave you guys about the school where we were implementing an exclusionary timeout procedure, and we attempted to use a timeout room, but the timeout room was too far, and the only other option really was the hallway. And after trying out the hallway a few times, we found that the hallway was not the best setting to implement a timeout procedure because of access to reinforcers. We ended up having a meeting with the school counselor and a few other key personnel in the school. And one of the things we discussed, actually they proposed this, which was really interesting that they proposed it. We were planning to propose it ourselves, but it was really interesting to see the school be the one to propose this. So the proposed intervention was that instead of removing the client from the setting, that we remove all of the students and the teacher to another room, because that would be much easier in this particular client's case than it would have been to remove that client and take him to a timeout room that was 5 minutes away. So in this particular case, removing everybody else was much easier and was much more feasible than the timeout room alternative. So now let's discuss when to use timeout and how to use timeout effectively. Okay, so like I've mentioned, timeout should not be your first method of choice. We should be exploring non-punitive methods first, and you should have data to back up that those non-punitive methods are ineffective prior to resorting to an intervention such as timeout. These are much more restrictive interventions. And we have to be very cautious when resorting to these types of interventions. Like I've mentioned, there are going to be situations in which the use of punishment first is warranted. And this is in cases of really severe forms of problem behavior, where the effects of the problem behavior could be much more harmful to the individual than the effects of the punishment procedure, possibly because the effects of the behavior might cause harm to other people in the environment, or severe it could hurt the individual severely, or it could hurt other people in the environment severely. There are going to be very few instances, only in cases of like very severe problem behavior, where the use of punishment initially is going to be warranted. In most cases and for most behaviors, you should be going through your non-punitive methods first, using your reinforcement-based procedures first, attempting all of those, teaching appropriate alternative behaviors, and using, differential reinforcement, non-contingent reinforcement, all of these reinforcement-based procedures first. And then once those are ineffective, then you can go ahead and get consent for a timeout procedure and develop a timeout procedure, or a punishment-based procedure. It doesn't have to just be timeout. It could be any punishment-based procedure that you deem to be necessary for that particular client. So let's discuss some additional things that you should do when you're implementing a timeout procedure. It's not enough to just have a great timeout procedure of how you're going to implement it, how long they're going to be in there, when you're going to stop running the procedure and all of that. You also have to have a plan to enrich the time in environment. Okay, we want to make it so that being in the environment, in the time and environment, is desirable. They are able to access reinforcers for engaging in appropriate behaviors. Okay, so in addition to having your timeout procedure for that behavior that you're targeting for reduction, you want to have certain behaviors that you are selecting or that you are targeting for increase. So you want to have alternative behaviors that you're targeting for increase. You want to have possibly incompatible behaviors that you're targeting for increase. So that this person is able to access reinforcement at a much higher rate for engaging in these appropriate behaviors. And instead of engaging in problem behavior, they'll choose to engage in the desirable behaviors. I'll give you guys some examples of appropriate alternative behaviors and some appropriate incompatible behaviors dependent on the problem behavior. So let's say that you have an individual that engages in problem behavior in order to gain access to attention from the teacher. Well, then you can teach them appropriate behaviors such as raising their hand. You can teach them to ask for help. You can teach them to approach the teacher and ask them for a hug, right? You can teach them to request attention in different ways. And it has to be ways that are going to satisfy the same function as the problem behavior, so that they're able to gain reinforcement for the appropriate behavior instead of the maladaptive behavior. Let's say, for example, that the problem behavior that the person is being put into timeout for is walking around the room. Well, then you can teach an incompatible behavior to walking around the room, and you want to reinforce that incompatible behavior. And an incompatible behavior for walking around the room would be sitting down in your chair or engaging in a particular activity. Okay, so you want to think of, are there any behaviors that are incompatible to the problem behavior that I can reinforce? And an incompatible behavior is basically a behavior where they cannot engage in the problem behavior and in the desirable behavior at the same time. So by increasing the rate of reinforcement that you're providing for the appropriate incompatible behavior, then they're not able to engage in that problematic or maladaptive behavior. You also want the ratio of reinforcement to be much higher for those appropriate behaviors than for the maladaptive behaviors. And what I'm trying to say is, and this is in the case of statements of approval or of praise versus reprimands. You want to have a much higher rate of positive statements, praise, or statements of approval than you do of reprimands. I've worked in so many settings where the teacher, I think, I don't want to talk poorly about anybody because teachers do have a lot on their plate. But I have worked in a lot of school settings where the teacher has a child that engages in problem behavior, and unfortunately they don't receive a lot of supports. They have a classroom with 20 other children that they're supposed to take care of and that they're responsible for, and then you have this one child that's engaging in problem behavior in that classroom, and the teacher only delivers reprimands. Johnny, stop doing that. Johnny, sit down. Johnny, how many times do I have to tell you not to do that? Johnny, why are you hitting this person? And then a ton of reprimands towards the participant or the client or the learner, however you want to refer to them. And there's no forms of positive attention being provided. And so how is this individual going to engage in appropriate behavior or be expected to engage in appropriate behavior when the few moments or during the moments in which they are engaging in inappropriate behavior, the teacher is not providing them with any positive attention. They're not providing reinforcement during those moments. Instead, they are simply delivering reprimands. And so the rate of reprimands outweighs significantly the rate of reinforcement. And we need to shift those scales. I tell teachers and I tell parents all the time, you need to shift the scales. You should be providing much more praise and reinforcement for the appropriate and desirable behaviors, and you should be providing much less reprimands or negative attention for the behaviors that we want to see reduced. And when we do this simple thing, in a lot of cases, when we modify the rate of reinforcement and reduce how much negative attention we're providing, we tend to see the behavior that is desirable increase in frequency, and we tend to see the undesirable behavior, the maladaptive behavior, go down in frequency simply because we are providing a lot more reinforcement. We're enriching the environment for that particular individual. Okay, so by enriching the time in environment, we are now making the disparity between the time in environment and the time out environment so great that individual is going to want to participate in the time and environment. They're going to want to engage in appropriate behavior in order to get access to those reinforcing statements, reinforcing stimuli, whatever it might be. And then finally, we want to make sure that once that person's timeout is over, okay, once they have experienced the punishment procedure for that specific problem behavior that they engaged in, and they return to the time in environment, you should no longer be reprimanding them for engaging in any behavior. You shouldn't be ignoring them or anything like that. That's it. They've received the punishment. Now you need to deliver reinforcement for appropriate behavior as much as possible and as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter if it's something as simple as them having their feet on the floor. You can say, oh my God, I love how you have your feet on the floor. If they're doing nothing else right, but they're doing that right, then that's what you need to deliver reinforcement for. If it's, oh, I like how you're holding your pencil in your hand, and that's it, that's the only correct thing that they're doing, you deliver reinforcement for that. So that you are enriching the environment and you're making it so that they are wanting to be in that particular time in an environment rather than engaging in problem behavior, because maybe problem behavior is the only way that they access attention and that they access reinforcement. We don't want that. Okay, so as quickly as we can, once they return from the timeout environment, we want to provide reinforcement for appropriate alternative behaviors. So continuing our discussion on how to appropriately set up for your timeout procedures, the first thing that you need to do then is define the behavior that's going to lead to timeout. You want to describe your behavior as clearly as possible using your observable terms. You want to make sure that everyone is clear on the definition that's going to result in timeout so that everybody is implementing the timeout procedure contingent on the same behavior. And then you want to give examples and non-examples of the target behavior to avoid confusion as much as possible. Okay, you could even train the individuals, everybody that's going to be possibly implementing the timeout procedure, train everybody on how to identify the behavior. You can sit down and you can observe the client with everyone and say, this is an example of it, this is not an example of it, in addition to your written out definition that they have in front of them. Next, you want to make sure that you are clearly delineating the type of timeout procedure that you are going to be having your team implement, and how you want to have very clear protocols on how they're going to be implementing everything. Okay, so in some cases, the schools in which you're implementing a timeout procedure or the institutions in which you're implementing the timeout procedure are going to have specific constraints which will guide you on which procedures you can and cannot use. So you have to keep these policies in mind in order to, like when you are deciding on which procedure to use. In the example that I gave you guys, we did not have a good timeout setting for the exclusionary timeout, and so ultimately we ended up having to not use the exclusionary timeout until the school offered the option of, well, let's take the rest of the kids out of the classroom, let's take the teacher out of the classroom, and we can try exclusionary timeout in that way. Because the setting that they had available for us to use as a timeout room was just too far, and the feasibility of it is, it wasn't feasible basically. And then again, remember that as much as possible, you want to consider the use of non-exclusionary timeout before resorting to something like exclusionary timeout. But in a lot of cases, even if you do want to use exclusionary timeout, as I mentioned, there are going to be some constraints within the organizations that you're working at that might not allow for the use of exclusionary timeout. Next, you want to make sure that you are obtaining permission from the administrators, from supervisors, that you are obtaining permission from your client's caregivers, from the teacher that you are going to be working with if it's in a school setting. You want to make sure that you provide as much information as possible to these individuals as well, so that they're able to provide informed consent on you implementing such an intervention. Okay, the intervention needs to be supported in the environment that we are planning on implementing it in. If you don't have support from the team, then you should not be implementing these interventions, right? You should not be implementing a timeout procedure if it's not likely to be supported in that environment, and if we don't have permission or consent to conduct those interventions. If you are ever going to implement something such as timeout, you need to have written consent from the caregivers in order to implement a procedure such as this, okay? And there are certain things that you want to decide on beforehand and have written out in your protocol so that it is clear to everybody implementing the intervention what exactly the parameters are for starting, for stopping, so on and so forth. So you want to decide beforehand the type of timeout that's going to be implemented, the behaviors that will result in timeout. You want to very clearly write out the duration of the timeout procedure. And then I haven't talked about this one, but you also want to discuss the behaviors that are going to allow the individual to return back to their time and environment. So in some cases, if in the case of severe problem behavior, you might want to wait for that person to calm down, or to show some responsiveness prior to being allowed to return to the time and environment. Because if they haven't calmed down, in the case of the client that I mentioned, where they would engage in severe forms of property destruction and aggression, even when we would remove him from the room, he continued aggressing towards us. And it wouldn't make sense for, let's say I had a 2-minute duration for timeout. It wouldn't make sense for me to bring him back in the room after 2 minutes if he hasn't reached a point of calming down and demonstrating that he would be able to reintegrate calmly into that time and environment. So for him, we did have to have some criteria for him to demonstrate some calm behavior in order to be able to go back into that environment. So as I've mentioned, you want to make the behaviors that will result in the timeout being implemented as clear as possible. You can provide, like I mentioned, a very clear and written protocol, or you should provide a very clearly written out protocol for the people that will be implementing the procedure. But in addition to that, you can have like a very easy like a sign that shows which behaviors are going to result in the in the timeout procedure being implemented, or something basically where your therapist can very quickly refer back to the protocol. You can have very simple steps that are written out for the teacher, in addition to the more complex protocol that might serve as reminders for them when they're implementing the procedure. You could have things like the duration, the timeout, the duration of the timeout, the behavior definition in there, and maybe you want to include like the exit criteria, and then the appropriate behaviors that they must be engaging in order to be reinstated into the time and environment. I also think that one thing that you can consider, depending on your learner's profile, you could also share some of these things, these contingencies, with your client. You can explain to them the rules for the behavior and the contingency that they're going to be exposed to if they were to engage in problem behavior. You can also share with your client the appropriate behaviors that are not going to result in this timeout procedure being implemented, and instead will result in reinforcement. So, you can. I like this slide because although this slide is particularly talking about sharing this information with your therapist and with your teachers, I think we can do the same thing with our clients and let them know these are the contingencies that are in place. These are the rules that are in place. If you engage in this behavior, this will happen. If you engage in this behavior, this will happen. When designing the duration for your timeout period, you want to choose durations that are as brief as possible. So if you had to choose between a 2 to 5 minute timeout period, and the 2-minute period is going to be just as effective as the timeout as a 5-minute period, then you want to go with the shorter duration. Just because the shorter duration they're both effective, right? If they're both effective, then go with the shorter duration because it's going to be the least restrictive. However, if a person has had some experience already with timeout in the past, and they've been exposed to very long periods of timeout already, then it's not likely that a short duration for the timeout period is going to function as a punisher for them, because they've already been habituated in a sense to that particular duration of timeout. And so for those people, then you would want to use a longer timeout period, simply because they have built some tolerance already to the duration for timeout. Sorry, and I said habituation earlier, but I meant to say tolerance. They've built tolerance to it. So you want to use you don't want to use longer timeout periods for a lot of different reasons, and the reasons are listed here. The first one is because the person may develop a tolerance and find ways to obtain reinforcers during timeout. So as I was mentioning earlier, you want to try to limit reinforcement as much as possible during the time in which they are in timeout, because if the timeout environment is reinforcing, then that means that it's not going to function as a punisher for the problem behavior that you're trying to reduce. And so the longer durations means that a person might find ways to entertain themselves, whether it be like looking at their cuticles and removing their cuticles, whether it be twirling their hair and braiding their hair. All of these are different activities that could potentially be reinforcing for that individual, which is going to be counterproductive to what you are trying to achieve. Next, the one downside of having a long duration for timeout is that it's going to remove the person from the time and environment, and it's not going to allow them to benefit from that environment fully. You're removing them for a longer period of time, and so they might not be able to participate in all of the activities that they would be normally participating in. Whereas if you had a shorter duration, they might miss out on a small portion of the activity, but they're not going to miss out on the entire activity. And then you also have to consider, as far as the duration for timeout goes, you have to consider the legal and the ethical aspects of a longer duration. In some settings, a long duration won't be allowed. And so you have to just consider the restrictions and the constraints within each environment that you're working in. And this goes for a lot of different procedures that we are going to implement. Primarily those punitive type procedures. These are things that you're going to have to consider very often. So you want to just be able to use timeout procedures that are short in duration wherever it is possible. And then because your duration is shorter, it's going to be easier to implement, and then the person will be able to reintegrate into the environment. Also, not only will it be easier to implement, but you'll probably be able to more consistently implement the timeout procedure. And as with the other punishment procedures that we've discussed, as well as reinforcement-based procedures, you want to make sure that you are implementing the timeout procedure consistently, meaning that every single instance of the behavior is going to lead to the timeout procedure being implemented, and again, in a consistent manner with a consistent duration and all of that, all of those different criteria being met. Again, you should have trained your staff on how to implement the protocol with fidelity. And then another important factor is not just training your staff, but also making sure that you are setting up ways to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. And this is, again, doesn't just apply to timeout. A lot of the things that you guys are hearing me discuss apply to many interventions, but they cannot be covered enough, which is why I'm taking the time to go over each of these things in detail. Okay, so you need to make sure that you are you or your staff, whoever it is that's implementing the procedure, are consistently collecting data on the intervention, the use of the intervention. So if they implemented timeout, they should write down the date, they should write down the initials of who implemented the timeout, or their name of who implemented the timeout, the behavior that resulted in the timeout procedure being implemented, for how long was the timeout procedure implemented, and did the individual engage in those exit behaviors or like the calming behaviors in order to be able to leave the timeout procedure. You also want to collect data on the individual's behavior before the timeout occurs, and then also their behavior after the timeout occurs and they've reintegrated into the setting. You want to also jot down any information about, how they are doing with reintegrating into the setting. Are you noticing any emotional disruptions? Are there any unexpected side effects that you're seeing? Anything like that. And all of this has to be documented for legal and ethical reasons. This is to protect you and to protect the clients as well. So you always want to have very clear documentation when you've implemented something such as timeout. And then, like I mentioned earlier, you want to also make sure that you have informed consent for procedures such as these. Now, to end the discussion on the topic of timeout, let's talk about setting a termination criteria for the timeout program. So the best time to select the termination criteria for the timeout program would be shortly after you've began the timeout procedure. Usually, when you make it to the point of implementing something such as timeout, it's taken a lot of effort to develop the procedure. It's taken a lot of effort to get approval for the procedure, especially if you're in a school setting. There's some safeguards that you've probably had to jump through and some approval processes that you've had to go through. And so it's very effortful in some instances, depending on the setting in which you have to implement the timeout procedure. It's very effortful to have to be able to get started with something like this. And so some people might be inclined to keep the timeout procedure in for longer than is necessary. Okay, so we have to make sure that we are letting the data drive our decision making in this case. Okay, and as we are implementing the intervention, we need to be sure that we are monitoring progress with the intervention. As soon as we are seeing a reduction in the behavior, then we need to consider possibly shifting gears into a less intrusive or less restrictive intervention. So if you're already seeing reductions in the behavior, you should set criteria for which percentage reduction will allow you to then consider a less restrictive intervention, such as maybe using differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors or differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. Are there more positive interventions that you can use instead, since you've already reduced the behavior to a more acceptable level, or a level that allows you to intervene with interventions that are more positive instead of punitive? If these things are not possible, well, then there's a few questions that you might want to ask yourself, such as, is timeout still necessary for the individual? You might want to ask yourself if there's less restrictive interventions that can be used. You can ask yourself if there are not less restrictive interventions that can be used. Well, you might want to ask yourself, okay, well, maybe we need to still use punishment. And timeout is still necessary, but can we go from exclusionary timeout to non-exclusionary timeout? Okay, so these are things that you just want to consider as you are beginning with your timeout procedure. You don't want to wait until you've already been using the timeout procedure for 2 months to determine when you're gonna what your exit criteria or what your termination criteria is going to be. This should be something that you plan for from the beginning. And then obviously, as with any treatment plan, as you go, you're able to make modifications to the program. That doesn't mean that just because you wrote something in a program to begin with, that's set in stone and that's how it has to be implemented. You're able to evaluate how a program is doing, how an individual is progressing with a particular program, and make modifications as you go. You never want to continue with a timeout or a punishment procedure beyond its point of effectiveness. So once you've demonstrated that it's effective, you've been able to reduce the behavior, you need to discontinue the use of it, because otherwise you are risking ethical violations and or possibly even some legal violations. Now we're going to jump into discussing the second type of negative punishment procedure, which is response cost. Response cost is when contingent on a occurrence of problem behavior, a person loses a specific reinforcer. Usually it's a generalized conditioned reinforcer that they have access to. So it could be something like money, or it could be like tokens that they have access to. It could be an amount of time that they're allowed to engage with a particular activity. So basically all it is that contingent on them engaging in problem behavior, they lose a specific number of those generalized conditioned reinforcers. So on the next few slides, I have some examples of what this looks like and the classification between the two types of response cost procedures that we have within behavior analysis. So let's start off by talking about why you would want to use response cost in comparison to some of the other punishment procedures that we have available to us. So again, response cost is a punishment procedure, and as you should know by now, punishment procedures result in, or should result in, if they're effective and if they by definition serve as punishment, then they should result in the reduction of the behavior that is being targeted for reduction. So reduction in the problem behavior usually. This is a procedure that works fairly quickly. It produces moderate to rapid decreases in behavior. And one of the main benefits really is that this is one of the least restrictive alternatives for reducing problem behavior. So if you had to decide between different punishment procedures, this is one of the first ones that you want to consider. If of course this is a good fit for the particular individual that you're working with, if it works for the setting that they're going to be in, and if it works for the problem behavior that you are trying to target. This particular protocol can be, or this particular procedure can be really good for individuals that engage in non-compliance or task refusal type behaviors, or individuals that engage in combative type behaviors. So we'll talk about how you can implement these procedures, but let's get into discussing the different types of response cost procedures first. Okay, so the two response cost procedures that we have are the existing catch response cost procedure or the bonus response cost procedure. This top one over here is just typically referred to as response cost, and the other one is referred to as bonus response cost, but your textbook does have like a longer name for it, and they call it existing catch response cost. So the first one, just the response cost procedure, is when you have an individual that already has a certain number of reinforcers available to them. This could be tokens. Let's say a person has to earn 10 tokens in order to gain access to playing with their phone. So they have to gain access to 10 tokens, but they already have access to 7. So they need to earn 3 more in order to be able to get access to the phone. So pretend that this person engages in, let's say, I don't want to use task refusal. Let's say they engage in aggression. So contingent on engaging in aggression, you remove a token. This token that is lost, they still have the ability to earn back by engaging in appropriate behaviors. Okay, so you're going to be pairing your response cost procedure with positive interventions that allow them to still gain access to reinforcers. You still want to teach appropriate alternative behaviors. You still want to teach incompatible behaviors so that they don't engage in the problem behavior or are not able to engage in the problem behavior. But that's kind of like a side topic, right? That's a conversation on just you wanting to make sure that you are always incorporating positive interventions along with your punishment interventions, which is something that we've discussed in the chapter 14 when we were covering chapter 14. So let's go back to the response cost. So basically, all it is an individual loses a specific reinforcer that they already had access to, or they lose a specific number of reinforcers. They don't lose the entire reinforcer, they lose a specific number, which usually it's a generalized conditioned reinforcer, like the tokens that I in the example I just gave you guys, which can be exchanged for something else. So it could also be money. So for example, you could have an individual that I have it in the next slide, so I'll show it to you guys in the next slide. But basically, it's an example with an allowance and contingent on engaging in problem behavior, they can lose a certain amount of their allowance. Then we have bonus response cost. Bonus response cost is when an individual already has a specific amount of reinforcers, and that specific amount of reinforcers is not going to be touched. They'll still be able to gain those reinforcers, but there's going to be a bonus amount of reinforcers that they can earn. And this bonus will only become available to them if they don't engage in instances of problem behavior. Well, that's not true, actually. It becomes available if the amount that they earn is contingent on how many instances of problem behavior they engage in, basically. So if they don't engage in problem behavior, they earn the entire bonus. But if they do engage in problem behavior, they lose parts of the bonus. And if they engage in enough instances of problem behavior, they might lose the entire bonus altogether. But their original number of reinforcers that were available to them, they'll still have access to. And I have, if you're confused by this, don't worry. I have some slides that I created to show you examples between different examples for each one, for the bonus response cost and then for the regular response cost, the existing catch response cost. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the existing catch response cost, or how you'll most likely hear it referred to in the field, which is just response costs alone. So an example is, let's say that you have access to 15 minutes of TV time, but contingent on each instance of problem behavior, you will lose 1 minute. So let's pretend we're talking about my son's, I mentioned that he stabs his fork on the table and it creates little dents all over my table. So let's pretend that's the behavior we're targeting for reduction. So if he has access to 15 minutes of TV time, contingent on him stabbing the table, each episode of him stabbing the table is going to result in a reduction of a minute. Okay, so let's look at what that would look like. So if my son were to engage in 5 instances of fork stabbing on the table, then for each instance, as soon as each instance occurs, I'm going to remove 1 minute of TV time. So he stabs the fork on the table, I remove 1 minute. He stabs the fork on the table, I remove another minute. And I'll say you lost 1 minute of TV time, contingent on the problem behavior, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to immediately deliver that contingency after each behavior occurs, after each instance occurs. So in total, then he would only be able to watch 10 minutes of TV time because he lost 5 minutes of TV time. Now let's look at an example for bonus response cost. And if you recall, I mentioned that bonus response cost is when you already have a specific amount of reinforcers that are available to you. Those are not going to be touched. But there's an additional bonus of reinforcers that you can earn, and those will only be available contingent on whether you engage in the problem behavior or not. Well, basically, it's not that they'll only be available, but the amount that you receive is dependent on the amount of problem behavior you engage in or do not engage in. Okay, so let's consider the example. So it begins by saying you earn $15 weekly for completing your chores. So that's the amount that you get. That's your standard amount. Okay. If you complete your chores, you get your $15. But you and your brother are constantly arguing, and your parents are tired of hearing you argue. So the parents want to reduce sibling arguing, and they decide that they're going to make $5 available each week. And those dollars are going to be available contingent on certain behaviors that the children engage in. If the children do not argue, then they get to keep their $5. But if they do argue, well, then arguing is going to result in each episode of arguing is going to result in the loss of $1 bonus dollar. Okay, so if they argue only 2 times in a week, let's say that there's $5 available. Well, if they argue, let's say 2 times, then they lose just the $2, but they'll be able to keep the $3. So this is their take home. Okay. again, they still get so they'll get those $3, and then as long as they completed their chores, they'll get the $15 reward also. So they'll get 15 plus the additional 3 that they earned as a bonus. I have another example for you guys on this slide. So let's pretend that we have a token board. This could be Tom's token board, right? If you would like to, you can write the date. You can also write the goal, however many pizzas they have to earn in order to get a reinforcer. So you can here, sorry, it says a date. I thought I had my pointer on, but I did not. So the goal, you can write the goal. How many do they have to earn in order to earn the reinforcer? In this case, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pizza slices that they can earn, and then they would write here what they're working for. And these are the possible reinforcers according to this example. These are the possible reinforcers they can select from. So let's say that I want to work for music time. I would put this icon over there. Okay. And what should happen is as I engage in appropriate behavior, or as Tom engages in appropriate behavior, I'll provide him with the pieces of pizza. Okay, so the pieces of pizza in this case are the tokens. So Tom engaged in appropriate behavior. I gave him 1 pizza. Tom engaged in appropriate behavior. I gave him another pizza. But let's say that I have a behavior that's targeted for reduction, and we have decided to use response cost as a procedure to target this behavior. Let's say the behavior is, we'll just stick to aggression. Let's say the behavior is aggression. Let's say that contingent on every single instance of aggression, I have to implement a response cost procedure. So what will happen is, let's say Tom has already earned, how many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pizza slices, but he engaged in aggression. So contingent on aggression, I'm actually going to put this pizza slice here back. So he loses access to that pizza slice. So what that'll look like is he doesn't have that one anymore. Okay, he still has, let's say, he still has this one. Okay. But I removed the other one, contingent on him having engaged in aggression. And if he were to engage in another instance of aggression, well, then guess what happens? I remove that pizza slice and it goes back. So then I remove that pizza slice, and now he only has 1, 2, 3, 4 pizza slices. So this is another example of using response cost procedure. So now let's talk about some parameters that you need to set in order for response cost to be implemented effectively. The first thing is that you want to delineate or have like a clear protocol for how to implement your response cost, meaning that you have to establish which particular behavior is going to be targeted for response cost. Okay, so what is that behavior? What is the definition? Provide examples and non-examples. Can your therapist or your caregiver, whoever it is, the teacher, whoever it is that's implementing the response cost procedure, can they appropriately identify the behavior that needs to result in response cost? Okay, you need to also let them know that the response cost needs to be delivered immediately. If for whatever reason you don't have an immediate response cost procedure, then you need to delineate that in the protocol and explain when exactly will the response cost be implemented. And then you also need to have very clear criteria for the amount of the fine that's going to result after having engaged in the problem behavior. So let's say that I say, if you engage in aggression, you lose 1 token. But maybe if you engage in property destruction, you will lose 3 tokens. Maybe if property destruction is a more severe behavior that occurs like at a higher magnitude, then we could provide a response cost that's greater, right? So we could distinguish between the response cost based off of the severity of the problem behavior that's occurring. And the reason why you might want to have like a higher magnitude response cost or a higher magnitude fine is because by having a harsher fine, right, or a harsher response cost procedure, you're more likely to see a larger reduction in the behavior. So for a more severe behavior, you might want to have a more severe punisher that you're delivering. One thing you also want to keep in mind is when you're taking away the tokens or the reinforcers, it doesn't have to be tokens, but I just gave the example of tokens. When you're taking away the reinforcers, you don't want to remove them too quickly, or the fine, you don't want the fine to be too large, because if it is, then what's going to happen is the person's going to lose all of their reinforcers, and then it's like, okay, well, I have nothing left to lose now, so I can just engage in a ton of problem behavior, and what are you going to do about it? You know what I'm saying? And so I'll give you guys this example. Let's say that we had Tom, right? So Tom, and we were targeting Tom's aggression. Let's say that I decide to make the response cost, the fine, let's say that the fine is 2 tokens contingent on aggression. So if he engages in aggression, he's going to lose 2 pizza slices. Well, let's say that Tom engaged in aggression. So he engaged in 1 instance of aggression. So I take away 2 pizza slices. 1, 2. But now Tom engaged in aggression again. 1 more instance of aggression. So I have to take away 2 more slices. So I say, okay, well, you lost 2 more pizzas. 2 more pizza slices. And now guess what? He's all out of tokens. And now pretend that he engages in a 3rd instance of aggression. Well, now what do? He's lost all his tokens, so I don't have any more tokens to reduce, to remove, which is going to be a problem, because how do I effectively then, how do I deliver a response cost procedure when there's nothing left to lose? And what's going to happen is it's going to create a situation where there's nothing left to lose. I've lost all of my reinforcers already, so I might as well just engage in more instances of aggression, because now there's no procedure that's being implemented. So I have nothing left to lose. That's it. So sometimes we see this. I see this in classroom settings a lot, where the teacher will remove reinforcers, and it's like, okay, well, now the kid doesn't have anything else to work towards. He doesn't have reinforcers available to him, so it's kind of like, well, you know, I don't have anything else to earn. I don't have any reinforcers. Here we go. I'll just engage in aggression. I don't have anything else to lose, you know. So that's just one of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're implementing a response cost procedures. You don't want to make it so that they lose the reinforcers so quickly where now it's like they have nothing left to lose. And I think the last point here is a really important point, which is that the fines should not be charged arbitrarily. And what this means is that you shouldn't just be coming up with what you're going to fine on the spot. You're like, oh, you know, oh, you engaged in aggression, so I'm going to take away 5 tokens. And then the next time they engage in aggression, you're like, okay, I'm just going to take away 1. No, it needs to be something consistent, and you also need to remove the emotion from it. That's why having like a specific protocol already in place that's delineating exactly how many tokens you should remove contingent on what behavior or the severity of each behavior is going to help you remain objective when you are implementing your response cost procedure, or it's going to help other people remain objective when they're implementing the response cost procedure. Okay, so let's talk about how to decide between the 2 response cost procedures that we discussed earlier. In general, in behavior analysis, and not just in behavior analysis, I think in general, people have the right to a least restrictive intervention to be used on them. Okay, and in this case, the least restrictive intervention is going to be the bonus response cost procedure, because with the bonus response cost procedure, they're going to still have access to the regular reinforcers, but they will have these additional reinforcers that they have the potential to earn. Okay, so the least aversive procedure in this particular case, you know, but when we're looking at these 2 procedures to implement, the least aversive procedure is going to be the bonus response cost procedure. So if you did have to implement a response cost procedure, that would be the one that you want to go with first. The next question you want to ask yourself is, what is the potential for aggressive emotional outbursts? if you are working with a client that does have the potential for aggressive or emotional outbursts, well, then the bonus response cost procedure is the procedure that's less likely to produce some of these emotional outbursts. Okay, so this is also a reason to go with the bonus response cost procedure first. However, if you need to work on reducing a behavior such as combative or non-compliant behavior, then a more appropriate intervention between these two would be the response cost procedure, just the regular response cost procedure. So now let's talk about what you can do if you don't have enough tokens or enough reinforcers and you end up removing all of your tokens or all of your reinforcers and the person is left with nothing left. So if you lose all reinforcers and another instance of inappropriate behavior occurs, what you could do is you can implement a timeout from positive reinforcement as a supplemental procedure. Okay, and as with any other procedure that we've discussed in behavior analysis, not every procedure is going to work the way that you intend for it to work. So you always need to evaluate how your procedure is affecting the behavior. Is your behavior increasing or is it decreasing? With response cost, we always want to see the behavior of interest decreasing, contingent on your implementation of the response cost procedure. But if your behavior is not decreasing and instead it's increasing, then you need to evaluate the use of this protocol because it's likely not functioning as a punisher and instead it's functioning as a reinforcer. And if that's the case, then you should discontinue the use of response cost and switch to a different type of punishment procedure or a different type of procedure in general. It doesn't necessarily need to be a punishment procedure. But I have had instances where I've implemented a response cost procedure. This was many, many years ago. I attempted to use a response cost procedure, and when I removed a token, the child was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I engaged in this behavior and she removed a token, and he instead engaged in the behavior again. And I again removed the token. He was like, oh, like I engage in this behavior and it has this effect, and instead for him it was functioning as a reinforcer. So I immediately, within seconds, I was like, okay, we're not using this protocol anymore, or we're not using this procedure anymore. And so we stopped using it just because I could tell that it was functioning as a reinforcer instead of as a punisher. And it was, in that particular case, it was a pretty obvious reinforcer for that child. But in some cases, you might have to carry out the intervention for longer to realize, oh, this is a reinforcer and not a punisher. Another problem that you might run into is that the person that you are working with might not hand back the reinforcer without a problem, right? Like they might engage in problem behaviors contingent on you having removed a reinforcer or attempting to remove a reinforcer. So there's certain things that you can do in order to mitigate this effect. One of the things you can do is have very clear contingencies and go over those contingencies with your client beforehand. So you would clarify the consequences of what would happen if they refuse to lose a token, or if they refuse to, give back a device if they've lost a minute on the device, for example. So you definitely want to have very clear contingency statement on what would happen contingent on each behavior. Okay. You also want to make sure that they have an adequate supply of that reinforcer still available to them. So for example, if let's say that the example that I gave you guys on the 15 minutes of TV time, let's say that the client loses 5 minutes of TV time and that they start to engage in problem behavior, you can tell them, well, you still have 10 minutes left. Like you lost 5 minutes, but you still have the other 10 minutes that are available to you. You can also, if they don't want to give up the reinforcer that they lost, you can also impose an additional penalty for them not giving up the reinforcer. But you can provide access to a part of the reinforcer if they do comply after you've explained to them the contingency. And then another useful thing that you can do is always keep the tokens in close proximity to you, or the reinforcer in close proximity to you, so that it's not easy for them to, gain control over it and try to, maybe grab them or take them from you in response to you having taken one away. As with any of the punishment procedures, if they're effective, tend to be negatively reinforcing for the person that's implementing the procedure. So you have to be very careful not to overuse the response cost procedure, okay? You want to use response cost only for major problem behaviors or behaviors that are maybe very disruptive, that you've tried other interventions for already and it hasn't been effective. So then again, this is a least restrictive procedure in terms of punishment procedures. So you can try this response cost procedure if needed, but just make sure that you're not overusing it. In all of the years that I've been in this field, I maybe have only had to implement response cost procedures a handful of times, or had to create a protocol for clients maybe only a handful of times. So again, you shouldn't be using this with every single one of your clients. There are very particular cases that call for the use of response cost, but it's not something that you should be overusing and using, all the time or with every single client. And then, of course, I already talked about this in the when we were talking about timeout. But one of the things you need to make sure that you do is that you are keeping record of what interventions you're implementing and which behavior is going to result in that response cost. So you want to just have everything clearly written out on a protocol. It's not something that you want to just tell the therapist to implement and have them, just provide verbal instruction and that's it, and just have them implement it. No, you want to have this documented, have a nice record of what behavior is going to result in the response cost procedure being implemented, where and when it should be implemented. As much detail as you can provide in that protocol, you want to provide it, just so that you have, some records and some proof, of how you documented, not documented, but how you meant for the intervention to be implemented and how it was actually implemented as well. And again, this is like a safeguard for you as a practitioner, and it's also a safeguard for your clients. It's going to protect them from overuse of a procedure like this. And it's going to protect you if anything legal ever comes up. Now let's review some response cost considerations. Although we've talked about some of these, I want to make sure that I go over them in detail. The first one being that when you're implementing a response cost procedure, you should be aware that you may experience, or the client may experience, increased emotional reactions like aggression, for example, or that the therapists themselves may become a conditioned aversive stimulus, and so the client may engage in avoidance behaviors or escape behaviors just by simply being in the presence of the therapist. When we can try to anticipate these different potential emotional reactions, then we can put parameters into place to try to mitigate those. So some of the things that we can do is to try to, obviously response cost is going to be an unpleasant procedure to implement. And so you want to make sure that you are delivering positive reinforcement I would say on a very rich schedule of reinforcement, so that client of yours is able to access reinforcement for a variety of different behaviors. So you're going to select different behaviors and you're going to provide reinforcement pretty heavily for those other behaviors. And this will help so that you're not being paired as a conditioned aversive stimulus, or whoever is implementing the response cost procedure is not being paired as a conditioned aversive stimulus, and also to reduce things such as aggression. You need to provide the opportunity for them to gain access to reinforcement pretty consistently, just to mitigate this secondary effect or the side effect of response cost. You should also be aware that when you're implementing a response cost procedure, it's likely that, it's not likely, but it is a possibility that when you implement the procedure, you're not only going to see a reduction in the target problem behavior, but that you might also see a reduction in other desirable behaviors. When this does happen, you want to try to, like I said, pair the intervention with reinforcement. You want to make sure that you're delivering high quality reinforcement for those desirable behaviors so that we can get those occurring consistently and we can see a reduction in the maladaptive behaviors instead. So just be aware that that is a possibility of a response cost procedure. You want to also make sure that you are delivering attention to, you also want to be aware that with the response cost procedure, since you're removing a reinforcer, you are also inadvertently delivering attention for the target behavior. If you have a behavior that is maintained by attention, it is possible that you will be reinforcing this behavior because the nature of response cost involves that you have to attend to the behavior by removing access to a reinforcer. So just be aware that this is a possibility as well. And then finally, I think this last consideration is a pretty big one. And it brings up the concern of treatment integrity, which is that our interventions might not always be implemented as we intended for them to be implemented. The therapists often drift from or not just the therapist, whoever the behavior change agent, sometimes drift from implementing an intervention in the way that it was designed. And so it's important that we as BCABAs, as BCBAs, are consistently providing supervision, that we're consistently providing feedback, that we are, conducting checklists, treatment integrity checklists, to make sure that the intervention is being implemented in the way that it was intended to be implemented, and that there's really no drift away from that. So often what we see when we implement a response cost procedure, we'll notice that once we see a reduction in the behavior, in the desired behavior, in the undesirable behavior, or the problem behavior, or the target behavior, whatever you want to call it, right? Once we see a reduction in that behavior, sometimes the behavior agent starts to feel bad in a sense, and so they will not implement the response cost procedure for the target behavior when they should have been. They might say, oh, but it's reduced enough. I feel bad. I don't want to implement it this time. And so what will end up happening is you'll have an inconsistent implementation of the intervention, which could result in the behavior recovering. So you'll see that behavior go back up. So you have to be very careful with that. The other concern is that sometimes the response cost intervention is so effective that the implementer begins to overuse the intervention. And so they're no longer just implementing it with the target behavior or the problem behavior, but now they're implementing it with other behaviors that were not part of the intervention and that were not originally intended to be included as part of the response cost intervention. And so the therapist or the caregiver or whoever it is, the behavior change agent, whoever is the person implementing the intervention, that person will start to implement response cost with other behaviors that they should not have been. So this is, again, something that you want to be careful with. This is like a form of overuse of punishment. Of course, we've talked about punishment procedures being negatively reinforcing for the person that's implementing them. And so, you just have to be aware of that yourself and be aware that, and whoever it is that you're training to implement these interventions, you have to teach them that these procedures will negatively reinforce their behavior because some aversive stimulus, right, the problem behavior is being removed, so that'll reinforce their behavior of implementing the punishment procedures. So as long as we are aware of this and we're training our staff, we're teaching them that this is a possibility, that can help to mitigate the effects of the overuse of a response cost procedure. This effect that I talked about, where the person misapplies a response cost procedure to other behaviors when they shouldn't have, is called a commission error. And that initial one that I talked about, where they're not implementing the intervention when they should have been implementing the intervention, that's called an omission error. So I have those two written here, and they're in your textbook also, so you can see them in the textbook as well, and they have more technical definitions for them there. This will conclude our discussion on the negative punishment procedures. I hope that this helps to understand the different types of procedures and when or certain considerations that you should keep in mind when implementing these different procedures.